The German shepherd's ears twitch. Something isn't right. The mansion, bathed in moonlight, is too quiet. A shadow moves. The security cameras flicker, then go dark. A low growl rumbles from the dog's throat. A storm is coming, one only he senses. The night was calm, deceptively so. Rain drummed softly against the vast glass windows of Daniel Whitmore's estate, casting silvery patterns across the marble floors. A fire crackled in the corner, its golden embers reflecting off expensive mahogany furniture. To anyone else, this was the image of security, of wealth wrapped in a blanket of comfort. But the German shepherd Max wasn't fooled. His golden brown eyes flicked toward the window, ears twitching at the sound of distant thunder. Something felt wrong. It wasn't the rain or the wind howling beyond the estate walls. It was something deeper, an instinct buried in his bones, whispering a warning his human couldn't hear. Daniel, oblivious, leaned back into the leather armchair, swirling a glass of aged whiskey. A sigh escaped his lips as he scanned the security feed on his tablet. Blank screens. His state-of-the-art system had detected nothing unusual. Of course not. He had spent a fortune ensuring his safety, cameras on every corner, motion detectors lining the perimeter. What could possibly go wrong? Max, lying near the fireplace, let out a low rumble in his throat, not a bark, not a whimper, just a quiet, uneasy sound. He rose to his feet, his powerful body moving with practiced grace, and padded toward the grand entrance. His nose flared. A scent lingered in the air, faint, unfamiliar, and wrong. Daniel glanced at him and chuckled. "What is it, boy? The storm?" He lifted his glass in mock salute. "Relax, we're fine." But Max didn't relax. His posture stiffened. His muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. His instincts had never failed him before, and they wouldn't fail him now. Across the room, on a wooden side table, sat an old, worn dog collar. The brass nameplate had long since faded, but Daniel knew what it said by heart. Duke, my best friend. His childhood dog. The only creature who had ever stood by him unconditionally. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. He had inherited everything: his father's fortune, his business empire, the mansion he now called home. But money never filled the emptiness, the weight of past mistakes pressing down on him like an anchor. He had bought security, luxury, power. But loyalty? That was something no amount of wealth could buy. Lightning flashed outside. Max growled again, deeper this time. Daniel's gaze shifted to the dog, then back to his blank security feed. The storm outside raged on. He had no idea a storm was brewing inside as well. The first sign of trouble came subtly. A flicker, barely noticeable, but enough for Max to react. His ears perked up, and his stance became rigid. Daniel frowned at his tablet. The security cameras had just blinked. Glitched? Number. This system didn't glitch. Max moved toward the door, his nails clicking against the polished floor. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his body was taut with anticipation. He sniffed again, stronger this time. The scent wasn't just unfamiliar, it was masked. Someone was trying to hide their presence. Daniel set his glass down, the unease in his stomach growing. Maybe Max was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a storm messing with the system. But something in the dog's stance, in the way his muscles were bunched like a predator preparing to strike, made him pause. Then the power went out. Darkness swallowed the estate in an instant. The humming of electronics ceased. The gentle glow of the fireplace was the only source of light now, flickering ominously against the walls. Daniel's heart thudded. His hands clenched into fists. He had seen enough movies, heard enough stories to know power doesn't just go out in a house like this. Not unless someone wanted it to. Max let out a single, warning bark. The kind that wasn't for attention, but for war. Daniel rose from his chair, pulse quickening. His mind raced through possibilities. A storm-related failure? A freak accident? Or was this something else? He reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Max stood by the door now, his body a solid wall of muscle, his stance one of a guardian on the brink of battle. His growl deepened. Daniel followed his gazebo the front door, where the handle twitched. Someone was out there. A slow, deliberate movement. Not the wind. Not an accident. Someone was trying to get in. Daniel's breath hitched. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but fear slithered through his veins like ice. His wealth had always protected him. He had never been the man inside the mansion when danger knocked. But Max wasn't afraid. His stance shifted, low and ready. His ears pressed back, tail stiff, hackles raised. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. Because that's what loyalty was. The doorknob twisted. The sound of metal scraping echoed through the silent room. Daniel's grip tightened on his phone. His heart pounded against his ribs. Max crouched lower, ready to strike. The front door creaked open, and all hell broke loose. The door swung open an inch, just enough for darkness to seep inside. The storm outside roared, wind howling through the gap like a whispered omen. Max moved first, no hesitation. A single explosive bark shattered the silence as he lunged forward, muscles coiled, teeth bared. The intruder reacted fast. A shadowed figure in all black shoved the door wider and stepped inside, moving with eerie precision. No frantic scrambling, no hesitation. This wasn't an amateur. Max didn't care. He lunged, his powerful jaws snapping inches from the man's gloved hand. The intruder barely dodged, stumbling back into the rain. But he wasn't alone. A second figure emerged from the darkness. Then a third. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Not a burglary, a coordinated attack. The power outage, the security system going dark. They planned this. Adrenaline surged through his veins, drowning out reason. He wasn't a fighter, wasn't a man used to physical confrontation. His battles had always been in boardrooms, fought with contracts and numbers. But right now, none of that mattered. Max let out a guttural snarl, his body a shield between Daniel and the intruders. His golden eyes burned with an intelligence far beyond instinct. This wasn't just loyalty. This was war. One of the men reached for something, a weapon, but before he could act, Max struck. A blur of fur and muscle launched through the air. His jaws clamped down on the man's forearm, a sickening crunch cutting through the rain. The man screamed, stumbling back, his grip on the object, a syringe loosening. It clattered onto the marble floor. A syringe. Daniel's stomach twisted. They weren't here to steal. They were here for him. The second intruder surged forward, pulling something from his jacket, a stun gun. Max released his first victim just in time, dodging the electrical crackle as the weapon discharged into empty air. He pivoted, teeth flashing, eyes locked on the next target. Daniel's paralysis broke. He moved on instinct, grabbing the closest thing within reach, a heavy glass whiskey decanter. Without thinking, he hurled it at the second attacker. It shattered against the man's shoulder, shards slicing into fabric and skin. A grunt of pain, a stagger. But not enough. The third man advanced, fast and controlled. This one was different, calm, almost methodical, not rattled like the others, a professional. His gaze flickered to Max, calculating. Daniel saw it happen before it did. The man wasn't going to fight the dog. He was going to neutralize him. Max growled low, muscles tensed, but the man was faster. From his belt, he pulled a small black device, a compact taser. Number. Daniel reacted before his brain caught up. He lunged, shoulder slamming into the man just as the taser crackled to life. The impact sent them both crashing into the side table, the old dog collar tumbling to the ground. The taser discharged wild, uncontrolled. A burning jolt streaked across Daniel's side, searing pain spreading like wildfire. He gasped, legs buckling. The world blurred for a second. Then Max roared. Not a bark, not a growl. A sound ripped from the depths of something ancient, something primal. The attackers had retreated, but they hadn't left. They were waiting. Daniel's fingers curled around his pistol. His mind raced. If they were still waiting, that meant they had reinforcements coming. More men, more firepower. Max's muscles tensed, his fur bristling. He was ready to fight again. But Daniel wasn't about to charge headfirst into an ambush. He took a slow breath, forcing calm into his limbs. Then he did something unexpected. He turned back. Not toward the house, but toward the forested area beyond the estate. Max hesitated only a second before following. The attackers expected him to panic, to either flee toward his car or barricade himself inside the house. But they didn't know him. They didn't know he had survived worse. The darkness swallowed them as they slipped into the trees, rain dripping from the leaves in slow, rhythmic beats. The world outside blurred, the mansion, security breaches, the ambush. None of it mattered now. All that mattered was survival. Daniel had money, but right now, money wouldn't save him. Instinct would. And Max. Always Max. The forest was thick, the ground slick with mud. They moved carefully, each step deliberate. Max's breathing was steady, his ears flicking at every rustling leaf, every distant sound. Daniel's pulse slowed. Good. Let them think I'm still in the house. Let them waste time. He reached for the burner phone and dialed the only person he trusted. The call connected on the first ring. Daniel? A voice, low and sharp with concern. Elliot, Daniel murmured. I need an extraction. Now. A pause. Then, where are you? Not safe, Daniel said. I'll send coordinates soon. But listen to Methus was planned. Someone wants me gone. Not dead. Taken. A sharp inhale from the other end. Who? I don't know yet. Footsteps. Somewhere behind them, distant but closing in. Daniel tightened his grip on the phone. Get me out of here. Elliot's voice was steel. On my way. The line went dead. Daniel exhaled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Rain dripped down his face, his clothes damp and clinging to his skin. He was cold, exhausted, injured, but he wasn't broken. And he sure as hell wasn't done fighting. Max pressed against his side, waiting for the next move. Daniel looked down at his loyal companion. We're going to make it, he murmured. You and me, buddy. Max didn't need words to understand. The night stretched before them, dark and uncertain. But as long as they were together, as long as Max was by his side, Daniel knew one thing for sure. They weren't going down without a fight. He attacked. His powerful frame crashed into the man, knocking the taser from his grip. Daniel barely had time to register the blur of fur and teeth before the intruder was on the ground, arms flailing, struggling against a force he had no chance of overpowering. Max's teeth clamped onto his shoulder. A scream tore through the air. Daniel staggered, breath coming in ragged gulps. The pain in his side burned, but he forced himself to focus. The first man was still on the ground, cradling his injured arm. The second was struggling to recover, blood dripping from his temple where the decanter had hit. The third, his strongest, was now pinned beneath the weight of an animal willing to kill for him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the first man, still clutching his arm, spat out a curse and scrambled toward the door. We need to go. The second man, face twisted in pain, hesitated but only for a second. He turned, staggering toward the exit, leaving the third behind. The leader, still beneath Max, saw the retreat. His struggling ceased. His breathing slowed. He knew it was over. Max growled, teeth still bared, waiting for the signal. Daniel could barely stand, but he didn't need strength for this. Let him go, he rasped. Max hesitated. His instincts screamed against it, but loyalty ran deeper than blood. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he released his grip and stepped back, his body still coiled like a spring ready to strike again if needed. The man pushed himself up onto shaking legs, chest heaving. He stared at Daniel for a long moment, then at Max. Then, without a word, he turned and followed the others into the night. The door slammed shut behind them. Silence. Daniel collapsed against the wall, sucking in air, heart hammering against his ribs. The pain in his side flared, but he barely registered it. His eyes locked onto Max, standing in the middle of the room, chest rising and falling, ears still alert. He had saved him. Not the security team, not the $1 million surveillance system. Max. The old dog collar lay on the floor beside them, its brass plate glinting in the firelight. Daniel swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. Slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on Max's head, fingers threading through his thick fur. You really are my best friend, he murmured. Max let out a soft huff and leaned into the touch. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, in the dim glow of the fire, Daniel knew he had already weathered the worst of it. Daniel's breathing was ragged, each inhale searing against his ribs. His muscles trembled from the aftershock of adrenaline. The house was still eerily so, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Only the sound of rain hammering against the windows remained, a steady, relentless reminder of the night's chaos. Max stood like a sentinel, his golden eyes still locked on the door, his body taut with unspent energy. He was waiting, listening. The fight had ended, but his instincts told him this wasn't over. Daniel forced himself upright, wincing as pain jolted through his side. The taser had left a deep, burning ache, but he had no time to dwell on it. He needed answers. Who were they? What did they want? He reached for his phone, again no signal. Damn it! His security system was state-of-the-art, yet it had failed. Or rather, it had been compromised. That meant whoever had orchestrated this attack had resources, skill, and a reason. His mind spun through the possibilities. Business rivals? A botched robbery? No, this was planned, deliberate. They hadn't stolen anything. They had targeted him. And that syringe? A cold realization slithered down his spine. They wanted to take him alive. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through him. He had enemies, sure any man of wealth did. But kidnapping? That was something different, something personal. Max let out a soft but insistent growl, snapping Daniel from his spiraling thoughts. The dog's head was low, his ears flicking toward the windows. He was still sensing something. Daniel turned toward the shattered glass decanter on the floor, the dark stain of whiskey spreading across the rug. The syringe lay nearby, its needle glinting under the firelight. Carefully, he picked it up, examining it. No markings, no labels, no sign of what it contained. His stomach clenched. His attackers had expected to incapacitate him first. The taser, the syringite, was a coordinated approach, meant to disable him before he could resist. Which meant they hadn't expected Max. That was their mistake. Daniel exhaled slowly, his pulse steadying. He had two options: sit here and wait for the next wave, or take control of the situation. He wasn't going to be a sitting duck. He turned to Max. We're not staying here. The dog's ears perked. Daniel moved quickly, gathering what he needed. His side ached, but he ignored it. First, a weapon. He wasn't a gun enthusiast, but he owned a firearm for emergencies. He retrieved the sleek black pistol from his desk drawer, checking the magazine before sliding it into his waistband. Next, a burner phone from his safe. He always kept one in case of an emergency, separate from his main line. He powered it on, waiting for it to connect. Max followed closely, never straying from Daniel's side. The dog was still on high alert, sensing the tension in the air. Finally, he grabbed a jacket, slipping it over his damp shirt. His hand hovered over the old dog collar on the floor. A strange sense of fate curled through his chest. He picked it up, running his fingers over the engraved brass plate. Duke, my best friend. He pocketed it. Then he moved. They exited through the side door, avoiding the main entrance. Max stayed close, his movements silent, trained. The rain was still falling in sheets, masking their departure as they slipped into the shadows. Daniel's estate was vast, surrounded by high walls and dense foliage. But the security breach had shaken him. He no longer trusted the system. He no longer trusted his own home. They needed to disappear. Max led the way, nose to the wind, tracking something unseen. Daniel followed, scanning the area with sharp eyes. His heart pounded as they neared the back fence. Then movement. A flicker of a shadow. Too fast, too deliberate. Max snarled. Daniel ducked low, pressing himself against the wall. They were still here. Watching. The rain had slowed, but the cold clung to Daniel's skin like a second layer. He crouched low, concealed beneath the thick canopy of trees, his breath measured and controlled. Max stood beside him, unmoving, ears twitching at every distant sound. Somewhere behind them, the intruders were still searching, their silhouettes barely visible through the curtain of darkness. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. His mind was racing. The coordinated attack, the security breach, the syringite, all pointed to one thing. Someone wanted him alive. That meant leverage. That meant power. But power for what? Max shifted, his golden eyes locked on something beyond the trees. A gloved hand, a figure moving. Daniel stilled. Two men, armed, their low voices cut through the silence like knives. He's not in the house. No, but he won't get far. Daniel inhaled slowly, focusing on every syllable. The second man adjusted something in his gripper rifle. This wasn't an amateur job. Max let out the faintest growl. It wasn't loud, but Daniel knew the dog was struggling to hold back his instinct to attack. Daniel placed a steadying hand on Max's back. Not yet. The first man exhaled sharply. We should have taken the damn dog out first. Daniel's blood ran cold. The client wants him alive, but they didn't say anything about the mutt. Max's muscles tensed. Daniel's fingers curled tighter around the pistol at his waist. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs. He knew what came next. The moment they thought they had him cornered, they'd make their move. The men stepped forward, scanning the area. Flashlights cut through the darkness, slicing across the forest floor. Daniel barely moved, his breath slowed. He had survived corporate betrayals, power struggles, lawsuits, but this was a different kind of war. Then one of the flashlights stopped, landed directly on him. Shit. There! Daniel moved. His body reacted before his mind did. He pivoted, throwing himself sideways just as the first gunshot rang out, the bullet striking the tree behind him with a crack. Max exploded into action. The dog lunged, a blur of muscle and fur, his powerful body crashing into the shooter. The man screamed as Max's teeth sank into his arm, his weapon clattering to the ground. Daniel didn't hesitate. He took aim at the second man. Pop, 3 quick shots. The attacker dove for cover behind a fallen log. Daniel scrambled forward, yanking the rifle from the man Max had taken down. The attacker groaned, blood seeping from deep bite marks. But the second man was recovering fast. Daniel turned just as the figure rose, gun aimed directly at him. A flash of lightning illuminated the face beneath the hood. Daniel's heart stopped. He knew him. The rain dripped from his attacker's face, streaking down in thin rivulets. The hood slipped back slightly, revealing sharp features, a scar running down the left side of his jaw. Daniel's grip tightened around the pistol. His pulse pounded in his ears. Elliot. His friend, his trusted ally, the man he had called for help. A bitter laugh formed in Daniel's throat, but no sound came out. Betrayal had a face now. Elliot didn't lower his weapon. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was steady calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment. Daniel exhaled sharply. So this was your plan all along? Elliot didn't flinch. Not exactly. Max, still standing over the downed man, bared his teeth, ready to strike, but Daniel held up a handweight. I trusted you, Daniel said, his voice hoarse. Elliot's fingers flexed against the trigger. I know. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The weight of years pressed against Daniel's chest. Elliot wasn't just a business partner. He was one of the few people Daniel had ever considered family. And now? Now he was standing in the rain with a gun aimed at his head. Who sent you? Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady. Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the wrong question. The wrong question? Daniel clenched his teeth. The right question should have been why. Elliot sighed, lowering his aim just slightly. You were never supposed to get away. They planned to take you quietly. No gunshots, no fight. But your damn dog ruined that. Max let out a deep, warning growl. Daniel's hands trembled. He tightened his grip on his gun to mask it. And you? Where do you fit in? Were you always a part of this? Or did you just sell me out when the money got too good? Elliot's jaw ticked. He didn't answer. That was an answer in itself. Daniel swallowed hard. So what now? Elliot tilted his head slightly, as if considering. Now? You put down the gun. Daniel barked out a laugh. Not a chance. Elliot's gaze flickered to Max, calculating. The dog hadn't moved, but his body was wound tight, waiting for Daniel's command. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Elliot said quietly. Daniel felt something crack inside him. Harder? He had spent his life fighting to protect what he built. But this? This wasn't just business. This was personal. And personal was dangerous. Daniel made his decision. He shifted his stance, slowly lowering his gun just enough. A signal, a trick, a lure. Elliot exhaled. A moment of relief flashed across his face. That's when Daniel struck. With a sharp, sudden movement, he kicked out, knocking Elliot's weapon aside. At the same time, he shouted, Now, Massachusetts X. The dog launched forward, his powerful body colliding with Elliot's chest. Elliot barely had time to react before Max was on him, knocking him to the ground. Daniel lunged, grabbing Elliot's gun before he could recover. He flipped it in his grip, aiming it squarely at his former friend. Max stood over Elliot, teeth bared, waiting for the order to finish it. Elliot groaned, his face twisted in pain, but he didn't beg, didn't even look surprised. Daniel's hands were steady now. Give me one reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger. Elliot's breathing was labored, then, slowly, a smirk. You still don't get it, he murmured. Daniel's stomach turned. Get what? Elliot coughed, blood staining his teeth, but his smirk never faded. They aren't done with you. Daniel's grip tightened. Who? Elliot just laughed, low, dark, like a man who knew something Daniel didn't. And then the sound of approaching footsteps. More men. More guns. Daniel's heart pounded. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel sat motionless, his breathing steady despite the fire licking through his ribs. The metal chair beneath him was cold, the room dim, but he wasn't focusing on the pain or the darkness. He was listening. The air was thick with damp concrete and cigarette smoke, but beneath it, he could smell something else: oil, metal, machinery. A warehouse. He flexed his fingers behind his back, testing the zip ties. Tight, but not unbreakable. His wrists burned where the plastic bit into his skin, but pain was secondary now. Survival was all that mattered. His mind was sharp, analyzing every variable. How many men? Where was Max? How long had he been out? The metal door creaked open. Elliot stepped inside, his silhouette framed by yellow light from the corridor behind him. He wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, tall and wiry, the other thick-built, arms crossed like he enjoyed breaking things. Daniel smirked despite the ache in his ribs. Amateurs. Elliot sighed as he stepped closer. You should have just cooperated, Daniel. Daniel's expression didn't change. Yeah? And what fun would that be? Elliot ignored him, pacing slowly. This didn't have to get ugly, but you, of all people, should understand something. He turned, leveling Daniel with a look of practiced indifference. Power doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the smartest. Daniel rolled his shoulders, testing his restraints again. Is that what this is? A lesson? Elliot smirked. Number its business. Daniel exhaled through his nose. And here I thought we were friends. We were. Elliot's voice was flat. Then you built an empire and forgot who helped you. You were untouchable, Daniel. But no one stays untouchable forever. Daniel held his gaze. He had trusted Elliot once more than he should have. But betrayal wasn't what rattled him. It was the precision of it. How much are they paying you? Daniel asked, his voice calm. Elliot's smirk widened, but there was something behind it now. A flicker of something unspoken. This isn't about money, Elliot said. Daniel frowned. His mind worked fast. If it wasn't money, then control. They didn't want him dead. They wanted ownership. Daniel's stomach twisted. Who's pulling the strings? Elliot skegged, shaking his head. See, that's the problem, Daniel. You always ask the wrong questions. He motioned to the thick-built man. A fist slammed into Daniel's gut. Pain exploded through his ribs, white-hot and blinding. He gritted his teeth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Elliot crouched down, tilting his head. They don't need you to talk. They just need you to break. Daniel coughed, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. He chuckled, the sound raw. Then they're going to have a long wait. Elliot sighed, standing. You always were stubborn, but don't worry, we have time. He turned to leave, but Daniel wasn't done. Where's Max? Elliot paused. He didn't turn around. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. You said he was alive. I want proof. Elliot exhaled sharply, then nodded to the wiry man. The guy disappeared through the doorway, and for a few agonizing moments, there was nothing. Then a low growl. Max. The dog was dragged inside, his fur matted with dirt, but his eyes, those fierce golden eyes, were still burning. His stance was shaky, but he was alive. Daniel's chest tightened. Good boy. Max let out a soft, low snarl but didn't lunge. He was watching Daniel, waiting, still trusting him. The wiry man yanked on the chain around Max's neck. The dog stiffened but didn't flinch. Elliot finally turned. He's a fighter, just like you. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. Max was hurt but breathing. That meant there was still time. Elliot glanced at the thick-built man. Make sure our guest is comfortable. Another fist crashed into Daniel's face. Then darkness. Daniel came to slowly, pain threading through every nerve. His face throbbed, his ribs ached, but his mind was sharp. Max. He had seen Max. Alive, hurt, but alive. That meant one thing. They needed him. He flexed his fingers, working at the zip ties. The plastic had shifted when they hit him, loosening just enough. Good. Footsteps. Someone was coming. He stilled, his breathing controlled, playing weak. Let them think I'm broken. The door opened again. Elliot. Alone. Daniel didn't move. Elliot stepped closer, sighing. I didn't want it to come to this. Daniel swallowed, keeping his voice hoarse. Then don't. Elliot shook his head. It's too late for that. He crouched, his voice lowering. You don't get it, do you? You're not leaving here unless you sign over everything. Your company, your assets, your life. Daniel's lips curled into a slow, bloodied smile. I'd rather die. Elliot's jaw tensed. That's the problem, Daniel. His voice softened. They don't need you alive, just compliant. Daniel's muscles coiled. Elliot sighed and turned toward the door. That's when Daniel moved. With a sharp, violent twist, he snapped the weakened zip tie against the edge of the chair. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the metal seat beneath him and swung. The chair cracked against Elliot's skull. The man staggered, eyes wide in shock. Daniel didn't stop. He lunged, grabbing Elliot's collar, slamming him against the concrete floor. Where's Max? Elliot struggled, gasping. You're making a mistake. Daniel's fist connected with his jaw. Elliot groaned. Daniel grabbed the key ring from his belt. Max. He needed to get to Max. He moved fast, slipping into the corridor. The building was industrial-old pipe, exposed wiring. He scanned the hall, listening. Then a low, familiar growl. Daniel's stomach lurched. He sprinted toward the sound, heart hammering. He reached the metal cage just as the wiry man turned, surprise flashing across his face. Daniel didn't hesitate. He tackled him, knocking the man to the ground. A struggle fast, brutal. Daniel's knuckles split against bone. Insolence. Daniel grabbed the keys, fumbling with the lock. Max was pressed against the back of the cage, his breathing heavy, but his eyes locked onto Daniel's. Still waiting, still trusting. The lock clicked. Daniel barely had time to brace himself before Max lunged forward, crashing into his chest. The dog's body trembled, but he was alive. Daniel buried his hands into Max's fur. Good boy, he rasped. Max let out a soft, shaky whimper. No time, no hesitation. Daniel stood. They were getting out. Daniel knew he was out of time. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder. Footsteps closed and steady, methodical. More men, more danger. His pulse pounded against his ribs, but his mind was eerily calm. He had seconds, maybe less. Elliot, still pinned beneath Max, let out a ragged breath, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Yet his smirk remained, maddeningly self-assured. You can't win this, Daniel. You never could. Daniel's grip on the stolen gun tightened. His body screamed for action, but his brain kept looping over the same thought. How did it come to this? Betrayed, hunted, driven from his own home like an animal. Max growled low in his throat, his body still coiled, waiting for a command. The dog didn't understand deception, greed, or betrayal. He only understood one thing: protect. Daniel's hands trembled. His best friend, his only friend. And it still hadn't been enough. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Shadows shifted between the trees. 5 men, maybe more. Daniel calculated quickly. The odds were worse than before. No element of surprise. No cover. I can't fight my way out of this. A cold knot formed in his stomach. For the first time, the thought of losing became real. The first man stepped forward, weapon raised. Drop it, Whitmore. Daniel exhaled sharply. The name Whitmore tasted foreign on their tongues, like he was just another asset, another number on a contract. His empire, his power meant nothing here. Drop it, the man repeated. Daniel hesitated. Max tensed. He was waiting, ready to tear through the next man that dared to make a move. But Daniel knew if Max attacked now, they'd kill him first. The thought sent something sharp and unbearable ripping through Daniel's chest. Not Max. Not after everything. He took a slow breath, hands steady despite the raging war inside him. Then, finally dropped the gun. The moment it hit the mud, 2 men rushed in, pinning his arms behind his back. Max exploded into action. A blur of fur and fury, he lunged, his teeth finding flesh. A man screamed as Max's jaws locked onto his forearm, but the second attacker was already moving fast. A single gunshot split the air. Daniel's body went rigid. The sound gutted him. Number. Max let out a sharp yelp, more shock than pain, but he staggered. Blood. There was blood. Daniel's vision blurred. Everything stopped. Something inside him cracked wide open. Rage. Pure, unfiltered, blinding rage. The men barely had time to react. Daniel thrashed, using the dead weight of his own body to throw them off balance. His elbow connected with one of their ribs, sending him stumbling. Another gunshot rang out too close. The sharp sting of pain tore through Daniel's shoulder, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He swung out, knocking the weapon from a man's grip, but the momentary victory was short-lived. A brutal punch landed against his temple. The world tilted. His knees buckled. Another hit his ribs this time. He gasped, the air forced from his lungs. Too many, too fast. A rough hand grabbed his collar, yanking him upright. Daniel barely had time to register the face before a final, crushing blow landed against his skull. The darkness swallowed him whole. When Daniel woke, the world was different. Pain greeted him first, dull and throbbing, pulsing through every inch of his body. His head ached, his shoulder burned, and his wrist bounds. He forced his eyes open. A dimly lit room, no windows, bare walls, a single metal chair beneath him. His heart pounded against his ribs. Where am I? The air smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. Underground? A warehouse? His mind was sluggish, still swimming through the murky waters of unconsciousness. He forced himself upright, shoulders screaming in protest. His hands were bound behind his back, zip ties cutting into his skin. Then movement. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Elliot. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing down the nausea and fury threatening to consume him. You son of a... Elliot held up a hand. Save your energy. Daniel's blood boiled. Where's Max? Elliot sighed. Rubbing his temple like this was just business as usual. Alive. For now. The words sent fire through Daniel's veins. He yanked against the restraints, but they didn't budge. If you hurt him. You'll what? Elliot's voice was almost amused. You're not exactly in a position to negotiate. Daniel's breaths came faster. Focus. Think. He forced himself to analyze the situation. Elliot wasn't working alone. There were men behind this powerful men. But why? Who are you working for? Daniel demanded. Elliot's smirk faded. Not your concern. Bullshit. Elliot exhaled, stepping closer. You want the truth? Daniel's gaze was fire. Try me. Elliot studied him for a long moment. Then finally, they don't want to kill you, Daniel. They want to own you. The words sent ice slicing through his chest. What the hell does that mean? Elliot's expression darkened. You built something powerful, but you made enemies. Real ones. People who don't take no for an answer. Daniel's mind reeled. He had dealt with competitors before, with threats, lawsuits, even blackmail, but this? Kidnapping me isn't going to give them control, Daniel bit out. Elliot's smirk returned. Number, but breaking you will. Daniel's stomach dropped. The realization settled in like a knife twisting between his ribs. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about leverage. This was about destroying him. He inhaled sharply. And you? What do you get out of this, Elliot? A cut? Power? Elliot's smirk faltered for the first time. Daniel saw it. The flicker of something. Hesitation? Regret? But then Elliot stepped back, face unreadable again. You should have stayed down, Daniel. Then he turned, disappearing into the darkness. The metal door slammed shut behind him. Daniel was alone. Bound. Broken. And for the first time in his life, truly powerless. But as he sat there, blood drying on his temple, wrists burning from the restraints, something inside him refused to surrender. They wanted to break him? They had no idea who they were dealing with. Daniel Whitmore wasn't done yet. And he'd be damned if he let them win. Daniel moved fast, gripping Max's collar as they slipped out of the dimly lit corridor. His body ached, his face throbbed, and blood still trickled from his temple, but none of it mattered. They had to get out. The warehouse was bigger than he expected. Rows of crates, rusted steel beams overhead, the distant hum of machinery. industrial district. Isolated. He glanced down at Max. The dog's fur was matted, his breathing heavy, but his stance was strong. Still fighting, still willing. Daniel swallowed hard. "We don't stop now." A distant voice cut through the silence. "Check on Elliot. Make sure he's still breathing." Damn it. They had minutes, maybe less. Daniel scanned the warehouse. No weapons, no easy exits. The main door was likely guarded, and he couldn't afford another direct fight. Think. Max suddenly tensed, his nose twitching. He turned toward the far end of the room, ears perked. Daniel followed his Gazian emergency exit. Perfect. He crouched next to Max, his voice low. "We move quiet, you hear me?" Max huffed softly in response. Daniel exhaled, forcing his body into motion. Pain didn't matter. Getting out mattered. They slipped between crates, keeping low. Footsteps echoed behind them, rushed, searching. Daniel gritted his teeth. Almost there. Thina voice. Too close. "Hey, over here!" Shit. A gun cocked behind him. Daniel didn't hesitate. He twisted, grabbing the nearest steel rod from a workbench, and swung. The impact sent the gunman staggering, but a second attacker was already moving too fast. The gun fired. Daniel barely had time to react before Max lunged. Teeth. A snarl. A scream. The man collapsed, the gun skidding across the floor. Daniel scrambled forward, snatching the weapon and firing once clean, precise. The second attacker dropped. Breathing hard, Daniel turned to Max. The dog's sides heaved, but his golden eyes were still sharp. Daniel let out a shaky breath. "You're saving my ass more than I'm saving yours." Max's tail gave a weak wag. They didn't stop. The emergency door was right there. Daniel pushed forward, shoving it open, and ran. Cold night air hit him like a shock. They were in an abandoned shipping yard, the distant city skyline blinking in the background. Still too far. Max stumbled slightly, and Daniel immediately reached down, steadying him. "Just a little more, buddy." Then headlights. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. Daniel's grip on the gun tightened. Another trap? Then the driver's side door flew open. Elliot. Bloodied. Furious. But behind him, another man stepped out. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. Richard Stanton. The billionaire. The one who had spent years circling Daniel's company like a vulture, waiting for an opening. The one who had everything to gain from Daniel's downfall. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his designer coat, looking every bit as composed as he always did. "Daniel," he greeted, voice smooth. "I have to admit, I expected you to stay unconscious a little longer." Daniel's blood boiled. "This was you." Richard smiled. "Of course it was." Elliot stepped forward, his lip bleeding, his gun still in hand. "You should have just signed the contract." Daniel barked out a laugh, sharp and bitter. "And let you take everything?" Richard exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't understand, do you? You think this was about money? About your company?" Daniel's jaw tightened. Richard's gaze darkened. "This was never about business, Daniel. This was about control." The words hit harder than any punch. Daniel forced himself to stay calm, his grip firm on the gun. "And what happens now? You kill me?" Richard skegged. No, that would be a waste." He nodded toward Max. "But your dog? That was never part of the plan." Daniel's chest locked. Max let out a low growl, sensing the shift in the air. Elliot lifted his gun, aimed it directly at Max. Daniel's heart stopped. Time slowed. Number. Not Max. Not after everything. Elliot's finger tensed on the trigger. Daniel moved. With every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he lunged. Bang. The shot rang out. But Daniel was faster. His body crashed into Elliot's, throwing off his aim. The bullet barely grazed past, missing Max by inches. Max attacked. The dog went straight for Elliot's wrist teeth, sinking deep. Elliot screamed, his gun clattering to the pavement. Daniel didn't hesitate. He turned the weapon in his hand and fired. One shot. Straight through Elliot's leg. Elliot collapsed with a strangled yell. Richard froze. His mask of control cracked for the first time. Daniel, breathing hard, turned the gun on him. Richard lifted his hands, his voice calm but tight. "Now, Daniel." Daniel's voice was ice. "Run." Richard hesitated. Max snarled. And finally, the billionaire took a step back. Then another. Then he turned and ran. Daniel exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. He let the gun fall to his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then warm fur pressed against his leg. Max. Daniel sank to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog. Max huffed, his body weak, but his tail wagged ever so slightly. Daniel buried his face against Max's fur. They made it. Somehow, against all odds, they made it. The sound of sirens filled the air in the distance. Help. Finally. Daniel didn't care about the company, the wealth, the business wars. None of it mattered. He pulled Max closer, whispering, "You saved me." Max gave a tired, satisfied sigh. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore understood what true loyalty meant. Some battles are fought with wealth, others with loyalty, courage, and the ones who never leave your side. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. And in the end, that was worth more than anything. Have you ever had a moment where some human or animal stood by you when no one else did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more cinematic tales of courage and resilience. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They wear fur.